Brilliant.
Yep.
So medieval women in Milton Keynes, I was quite excited to be asked to speak to you, because I suppose when we think about women in Milton Keynes, we don't necessarily think that far back. And there were medieval women in Milton Keynes, and I'm going to talk to you about three of them, which relate to the Bradwell Abbey site that I work at. I work at Milton Keynes City Discovery Centre, and if you're familiar with MKCDC and Bradwell Abbey, you'll know that there used to be a medieval priory there. Now, the first medieval woman I'm going to talk about is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who has a slightly tenuous link to the site, possibly. I'll explain that a bit later. I'm also going to talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary, as she is known to the Catholic faith, and it was Catholic faith at that time. And you can see to the right of that image of the 14th, there's a 14th century image of Mary and Christ. To the right of that is a 14th century painting of her within our chapel at Bradwell Abbey. And I'm also going to talk to you about a medieval woman that was discovered last year. And just to warn you, there are images of the remains being excavated. So if you're sensitive to skeletons or human remains, it is only skeleton. I'd advise you perhaps not to watch. So Milton Keynes City Discovery Centre has an interesting place in history. It exists because of the new town, and we hold a significant proportion of the new town archives, which the Development Corporation gifted us in 1987. But the site itself has been occupied continuously since 1154 and possibly earlier. 1154 is when the priory was founded by the local lord in Wolverton, and based at Bradwell Abbey. So it's a 12th century Benedictine priory, the pre-dissolution proceeds of which passed from Henry VIII via Cromwell to Wolsey to found Cardinal College in Oxford, which is now Christ Church, Oxford. And we have got quite strong medieval links with them as well. And we specialise in extracurricular learning, where we give children, mainly school children, very exciting immersive experiences where they get to dress up and meet people from the Middle Ages, or they meet Roman soldiers, or they participate in terrible Tudor torture. It's a lot of fun. But today, with the female story, I'm going to talk to you about our role in the 12th century and the 14th century. So the first medieval woman I'm going to talk about very briefly is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who you probably heard of. She ascended the throne with Henry II around the time of the foundation of Bradwell Priory, so that's important. She was known for her piety. She had strong links to the Benedictines, and as you'll recall, I've said Bradwell Priory, as it was known then, was a Benedictine monastery, and she had strong links with the Benedictines, particularly in her native France. She's a very powerful woman with significant influence as well. Now, here we have some contemporary images of her from the 12th century. So to the left, you've got Eleanor herself. In the middle, you've got King Henry II, her husband and king, and then you've got an image of them both together. And these are very stylized images. We don't know if this is what she looked like. We don't know if this is what Henry looked like, if they're best guesses, or if they're based on if the artist in question had actually seen them in person, or if they're based on descriptions. Now, why Eleanor is important to us is last year and the year before, we have been carrying out conservation works on site to restore elements of the medieval farmhouse, the chapel, which has now been completed, and other medieval buildings that are left on site. And high up in one of the gables of the farmhouse, which is a Tudor farmhouse, we found, or the stonemason who was doing the repairs actually found this stone. And we're not sure if it's Eleanor or not, but there's a reason why we're calling it the Eleanor stone. Now, the stone itself is made of oolitic limestone, it dates to the mid-12th century, which is around about the time that the church was built, not the chapel, the actual priory church. It's one of a pair of what we call stop ends, which are usually facial carvings that sit on the other side of windows. And we do have the other pair, which I'll come to in a minute. It was taken from the Bradwell Priory Church, probably just after the priory was dissolved in the early Tudor period, just before dissolution, and reused as a dressed building stone. Interestingly, it was found high up in the gable wall, very high up, with its face to the wall. Now, interestingly, the image we have of Eleanor, it's hard to tell from that angle if it's masculine or feminine, but we have the other pair, which was discovered some years ago, also used as building materials. The pair that goes with it, also wearing a crown, also quite regal, is definitely masculine. And although, as I've said, it's hard to know if contemporary images actually look like Henry and Eleanor, to a degree, the carvings look like the contemporary images of Eleanor and Henry. So we wonder if the stonemason at the time, making the carvings for the newly founded monastery, was showing some political canniness and carved the new monarchs just after civil war, who were just ascending the throne. It's possible. And what's really interesting about the placement of the Eleanor stone is that she was found very high up, with her face actually into the wall. And what's interesting about that is that during the Tudor period, different monarchs. So the Tudor farmhouse was built using materials from the priory during the reign of the first Tudors. Now, Henry and Eleanor were the first Plantagenets, and Richard III was the last Plantagenet. So Henry VII is the first Tudor. So we think there's perhaps a little bit of a political snub there to the Plantagenets, because it was quite common to use stones as dressed stones, but they would have just chopped the face off and made it into a proper building stone. It's been very, very carefully placed with its face turned to the wall. It's a very interesting story, and this is the stone close up. As I said, it's hard to tell from these images just how feminized it is, but it is a very, very feminine face, particularly compared to the masculine one that we have. So that's Eleanor. And just one more thing about her. We don't know if Henry and Eleanor visited Bradwell Priory. It was quite a small monastery, not of great note, but they did visit priories in Buckinghamshire, so they were certainly around in the area at the time that the carvings were made. The second medieval woman I want to talk about is the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, Bradwell Priory Pilgrimage Chapel, which is also called the Chapel of St Mary, it's dedicated to Mary, which you're probably all familiar with the images of this tiny little chapel, kind of alone in what looks a bit like a desolate landscape. It's the 14th century priory chapel. It's different from the church, and it's all that remains that you can see of the original priory. There are actually remains underground and hidden within other buildings, but this is really the only remains that you can see. Now, the chapel itself was built because there was a statue of Mary in the outer niche of the church, and it was said to have healing powers. So pilgrims started coming to pray to her. The monastery wasn't doing very well, so they saw this as an opportunity to make money, those clever monks. So they built a chapel around her statue. They charged pilgrims to come and pray. And Mary in the Catholic Church, which it was then until Henry turned us all into Protestants at that time, because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary was seen as a very powerful intercessor. She was a powerful woman within the Catholic Church, just as Eleanor was. And she was an exemplar of desired and influential behaviour. She was a role model for men as well as women in terms of how they should behave, in terms of literacy. There's many contemporary depictions of her teaching her mother teaching her to read, and also in terms of how you should worship. And I don't know how clearly you can see these, but that there are lots of paintings in the chapel of her, as well as stories from the Bible, and that the most relevant one is the one of St. Anne and the Virgin reading. And at a time when most people couldn't read or write, the liturgy was learned in churches and chapels through the paintings on the wall. And here we have another one of St. Anne teaching the Virgin to read. So people would see the images and learn from the images how to behave. And that was a kind of vernacular literacy. And quite a few medieval women could read and write, but they would have those skills for household duties and so on. So they weren't all illiterate, but that kind of thing we don't know so much about now. We think it's probably just high status women who are literate, which is mostly the case. And here are just some images that we pulled together about Mary in the chapel. But I'll just move quickly on because I've only got 15 minutes. I'm running out of time. Then we have the 14th century unknown burial. I am going to show you a very quick video, so sensitivity of the excavation, but just to let you know, we followed national standards guidelines, and we had a license from the Home Office to do this. So the unknown burial is possibly a female in her mid-20s, as you'll see from the quick clip. She was excavated July 2020, thought to date to the chapel, mid-14th century. No coffin, but a very careful burial. And you'll see in the quick video, large stone placed over her pelvis. There was also one over her face. And it's interesting how carefully placed. There were a lot of stones of that size placed over the remains. So the burial is of some significance if it's not of status, but we don't know who she is. It's not unusual for females to be present at monasteries. They might have had something to do with housekeeping, or they might have been related in some way to the prior or the monks. What's really interesting is, though, she's buried the wrong way around for the resurrection, which is fascinating. So I'm just going to turn my screen around and share this video with you, because I couldn't embed it in the PowerPoint. So here we go. Oh, no, that's me. Can you all see the video? Yeah.
More than 100 extra bones. As you age, the bones end up fusing together, and you estimate how old based on that. But the fusion process sort of completes between the ages of 20 and 25, and the clavicle actually. So this bone is the last bone to fully fuse, and everything to me looks fully fused. So I would say sort of mid to late 20s.
So we know the age, and we think it's female because the bones and the structure of the skeleton are what we call gracile in archaeology, and that suggests that she's female. So really, just to end, it's just a quick chop through 3 medieval women that we know had some relation to Milton Keynes, Buckinghamshire, as it would have been then, because as we know, Milton Keynes was actually the medieval village, which is now Middleton. And I think women, not just as now, but even then in history, were overlooked, and they had importance. And for me, all those 3 women, there's a slight mystery surrounding them and their relationship to Bradwell Abbey now. Why this female stone hidden high up in the wall? What was significant about that stone that she had to be hidden, if that narrative is there? Mary, much more influential than in the Middle Ages and probably given credit for, in terms of her intercession with the great patriarchy, i.e. the church and God, although I think the church at that time used that intercessory influence to impose standards of behaviour upon people, certainly upon women. And our last medieval woman, the unknown burial. Who is she? What is she doing there? Why is she buried the wrong way around? And why is that a status burial with the very carefully placed stones? I can't answer any of those questions at the moment, but I think with the skeleton, we will get quite close to some answers. The bones are going to be analysed, and we're going to do some documentary digging and find out what we can. And there's some really interesting information we found out so far that I'm not yet at liberty to share, but it will be full of impact when I do. And I'm hoping we can share that information soon. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed that.